my question relates to the general madness about coal seam gas and the health impacts, the damaging impacts on communities and general pollution of our groundwater and land. So what's driving this madness? I suspect it's got something to do with the $4 million that was donated to the Coalition and the Labor Party since the last federal election. And there is enormous amounts of subsidies now that come back in turn to the fossil fuel industry. There's a site called Pollution Free Politics, which promotes a lot of details about the politicians that are deniers, or the dirty 30 in particular, the really bad ones. Pollution Free Politics, it's called. And it's a useful one to have a look at to inform yourself about who are the blockers and who you might have some hope contacting and lobbying to try to get them to change their minds. But about $8 billion a year of our taxes now go to direct subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. And if you include externalities, the International Monetary Fund estimates between $30 and $40 billion. In Australia, every year, governments subsidise the dirty fossil fuel industry. So, question, what's your view in terms of how much impact political donations have on polluting the minds of politicians?
The answer is a very, very big impact, of course. So yes, state and federal governments subsidise the coal seam gas and coal industry. Yes, we know that they don't pay tax. They pay very little tax, but some of them don't pay any tax at all. So that's, of course, another form of subsidy. You know, those externalities Phil was talking about, some of those are, for example, the enormous health impacts of coal dust, of pollution from the coal industry, mining and power stations, and of course from unconventional gas, that amount to hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every year just in New South Wales. So the cost of those health impacts is really enormous, and they're borne by the people of New South Wales and of course by taxpayers. But the question about political donations, you know, it isn't just in the last 4 years though, or since the last federal election, which the Pollution Free Politics, rightly looks at and sums up. Get on board that website and those actions there. But you know, these gas licences were approved largely under the Labor government, which you know we've seen through ICAC inquiry after ICAC inquiry. You know what money was changing hands in those processes that were, of course, greasing the wheels of the planning process to approve these licences in the first place. You know, since a change in government in New South Wales, you know, we've been seeing just in the last week an enormous political scandal unfolding in relation to political donations, you know, washed through foundations, you know, and then donated to the Liberal Party. Santos make an extraordinary amount of political donations, to the Liberal Party at the moment, and AGL did as well. And the community in Gloucester set about looking at this. You know, they went through in excruciating detail the party's logs of who donated to them. During the approval process for AGL's Gloucester gas field, of course it was approved, they looked at the corporate documents and they looked at the official declarations of political donations. They found that AGL donated over $100,000 during the approval process for the Gloucester gas field, and that a vast amount of those donations were unreported, making them illegal. And that community has spent a really long time trying to prove that. And they, you know, got front pages of the Sydney Morning Herald and other papers, and not very much happened. You know, they were doing this amazing investigative work, showing the corruption or showing the dodgy deals happening behind the scenes that allow these gas projects to be approved, you know, in the middle of dairy farms, in the middle of communities. And no one cared, but they kept at it. And, you know, long story short in this one is that they forced AGL to change their policy, that community, through their campaigning. AGL no longer make any political donations at all to any party. They've banned that, they've made that decision at a board level. And I think that shows the power of a small community campaigning to a really big company. But they also force the New South Wales government to prosecute. And AGL just pled guilty to 11 counts of unlawful political donations in New South Wales court. And, you know, I'm awaiting a sentence. I think it should be big. Probably won't be big enough, but there's a real moment of justice, I think, for that community.
Okay, well, I can't top Holly's answer in regard to fugitives, but just a couple of things to mention, Phil. You put the case very well, you're absolutely right. Fugitives isn't a huge problem. What we do know is that the IPCC revised upward how bad the problem is when they produced their last set of global reports. And around that same time, there was another organisation called the Rhodium Group, commissioned by a US Environmental Defence Fund. And they did a study where they estimated the impact of methane, as Phil said. I think Phil mentioned a 10-year time frame, but they estimated what would be the impact of all of the oil and gas leakages globally, because we know that there is 1 to 4% or thereabouts of pretty much every gas field is going to be leaking methane into the atmosphere. So what does that look like against coal emissions globally? And what they found that over a 20-year time frame, worldwide leakage from oil and gas operations had the same near-term climate impact, so over 20 years, as emissions from 40% of total global coal combustion. And bear in mind, that's just the leakage. That's not even when you burn the gas and get further global warming gases from that. So huge definitely very, very concerning. And what a lot of the climate scientists say, of course, is that we haven't got any idea how close we are to a tipping point. So if we had the luxury of waiting for 100 years and then figuring out the problem, was that as bad as we thought? We simply may not have that time. No one knows. It's a complex system. The only other quick thing I would say is that you might have seen a little bit of coverage in the news a couple of years ago about some studies where they were trying to characterise the fugitives problem in Australia from gas wells. That study was heavily criticised because the industry offered up the wells that were tested, and there were very few wells tested. So if you're going to be tested by, for fugitives, you're going to offer up your best wells, aren't you? There's a new study that the EPA is collaborating with the CSIRO on, but effectively they're going to repeat the methodology. So the EPA and CSIRO won't get access randomly to wells. The companies will put forward wells and only those wells can be tested. So, I would have thought not a particularly scientific exercise. If you want to know what the nature of the problem is in New South Wales, in Australia, you would have a random access to wells with proper scientific methodology. But certainly a huge problem. So thanks for your question, Phil.
As I'm a doctor by profession, trained in occupational medicine, I was involved in the anti-tobacco campaigns and I was an MP and I became a farmer. So I've actually taken a lot of interest in a number of things that impinge on this. And the first thing I'd say from my anti-tobacco days is one of the cleverest things tobacco did was to reverse the onus of proof. They didn't have to prove it was harmful, we had to prove it was, they didn't have to prove it was harmless, we had to prove it was harmful. And then when it was proved that it was harmful, which they denied for 20 years, we then had to prove that passive smoking was harmful, and then they denied that and still are. So that took 50 years, right? Now the point is here they're saying, oh, there's no proof, and Holly was saying there's no baseline studies. There doesn't have to be baseline studies. They have to prove it's harmless. And they have to prove the gas isn't escaping, when obviously if you smash the subterranean rock and you have sediment over the top, it will come up through the sediment. And the proof has to be the other way around. So, I mean, I would say in all of this, we must not concede that we have to prove. It is they who have to prove it harmless, and of course they can't. Now, the other thing that happened while I was in Parliament was there was a lot of argument over water and aquifers, and the nature and distribution of water, subterranean water through the rock folding was very controversial, and of course the extraction licenses and the desertification and so on were very important. Now, if you completely smash all those levels, and you'd be aware of the things at Douglas Park where underneath the catchment of Sydney Water, they simply long wall mined, and the river simply disappeared down the hole, basically, to a subterranean level. Now, there's absolutely no reason why that wouldn't happen when you frack. It's exactly what you would expect to happen. If you have a layer cake and you bust the layers, the sogginess goes to the lower parts. I mean, it's very, very simple. Again, they'd have to disprove that. So, in fact, as a person who sewed together coalitions against tobacco, I would say the irrigators and the water, people concerned about water, must be concerned about fracking, and as are the people concerned about greenhouse gases. as are the people who are concerned about the health effects, because the health effects are caused by the emissions of methane, I would think, and other toxic gases coming up, not captured by the wells, but in fact coming through to the surface. And of course there's a Jeremy Buckingham video that's gone viral just last week of water coming up through a river, and you can actually light the gas coming out of the river, which of course, presumably that only you can light it in the river, or you only see it coming out of the river, otherwise it just goes up into the air and makes the people sick. So, but what I'd ask you is, what's the chance of getting rid of this export industry that we don't actually need completely? I mean, the Americans have stuffed their country, but we can stop them stuffing ours. What's the chance, and how do we do it?
There's a very good chance of stopping the industry. It's going to be really hard work. I think Nick has to go. You know, there are a number, in Queensland in particular, a number of enormous gas fields. And, you know, I mean, there are these companies who set about, you know, building huge gas fields, sinking billions of dollars, building, you know, a large number of, sort of in North Queensland and Gladstone and the like, you know, gas exporting facilities. They were planning for this enormous boom, and it hasn't happened, and it's never going to happen. So they've built enormous amounts of infrastructure. So they've just sunk, you know, billions upon billions of dollars, and now they're backpedaling. And it's like this in coal too. You know, there's been some great stories in the last couple of days about Shenhua, you know, sinking, you know, hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars in the proposed coal mines in the Liverpool Plains. They need to sink billions more. And they shouldn't, because these projects aren't necessary, they're not needed, and the world has changed. So I think, you know, what's it going to take? You know, increased pressure. You know, the people who are right now in the Pilliga Forest, they have been stopping the construction of that wastewater treatment facility. They'll stop the construction of the rest of the gas field and associated facilities. They need your support. But the market really has crashed. The economics really are changing. And renewables really are emerging. So I think what we're doing has been working. We need to do it. We need to do it more for longer, and to really just keep building the movement and doing the work we're doing, because it has been extremely effective.
The South Australian Premier announced the lifting of the ban of the nuclear waste dump in South Australia 2 days before World Music Adelaide a fortnight ago, and David Suzuki flew in that night, and all the journalists asked him what he thought, and he let the Premier of South Australia have it both barrels, and the Nature Conservation Council stall at the World Music Adelaide did a roaring trade of 10,000 postcards protesting to the Premier, which is about 1 in 5 of the people attending the festival over that weekend. So there's hope and inspiration from the masses everywhere, and that raises the question of double disillusionment and potential federal elections. I notice that already there's a mob that have put their hands up for the Arts Party. Now, are the Closer Gate people going to run a Senate ticket, or are they going to back the Green? With the voting now 6 or 12 below the line and 6 above, does that leave an option for a Senate campaign, or are we just going to be campaigning to get a former National Party guy in Barnaby Joyce's seat re-elected and getting rid of a shocky Deputy Prime Minister? I'm just saying the potentials are opening up in the next 6 months for a political change here.
I think the news this week shows that it's, you know, potentially unlikely to be a double dissolution election. But communities are absolutely organising hard where they are, and I mean there isn't going to be, you know, from my knowledge, you know, a kind of new party emerge, but there are, you know, strong candidates running, including independent candidates across the country. I think, you know, I was crunching the numbers today of federal electorates and those that had the highest coverage of coal and gas licences in them. And, you know, would you believe that the electorate that has the most, you know, the highest percentage of it covered by coal and gas licences is actually the electorate of Macarthur in Western Sydney. You know, that electorate is blanketed by coal licences, some gas, but fewer now as a result of a big public campaign. So it's sort of not a thing that's necessarily far away. Look, I reckon that there are multiple strategies, you know, running toward the federal election. Some of them are about, you know, the most offensive, you know, blockers of climate action currently in the Liberal government. people who deny the existence of climate change, who champion the destruction of our farmland and water resources for mining. Communities are really, they may not be marginal seats, but they are putting an enormous amount of effort to make sure that those blockers in our federal parliament cannot be returned to their position of power.
Another concern to add to the many which have been raised tonight about CSG is some of the detection methods, namely the use of the radioactive isotope caesium-137. A couple of years ago there was a report in the Herald about its use in detection and how in fact it wasn't even, as far as I know, even sort of part of the planning documents and so on, which I'm not sure which company it was, but it wasn't even referred there. And then there was many sort of issues to do with the lack of security in securing it, and also it's finding its way into the aquifers and into the other wastewater and so on. So I was wondering what the current situation is with the use of, have there been further sort of problems found similar to that, or is it still being used extensively?
It's a very specific question. I remember I gave myself a real crash course when that happened, on that particular element. It's not in the reaches of my brain. That was in Gloucester though. It was the AGL project in Gloucester. There were a number of leaks in late 2014. And there were also findings that there were a number of chemicals on the fracking list, or the fracking chemicals list, the community fought hard to get access to, that were not being monitored. So there's a number of highly toxic chemicals that were used in the process or present in the process in some way that AGL nor the government were looking for at all around the site in the surrounding waterways. And so that was one of them. I think from memory it was just not being monitored, and the community made a really big fuss about that, and forced the monitoring to improve. And there has been behind the scenes, like due to huge amounts of community pressure, gradual improvement and greater investment in how many water monitoring bores are there. We went from very few to a much more significant amount. What was the budget for water monitoring at an EPA level? That stuff is nowhere near sufficiently funded. The EPA is massively underfunded. Not long ago, the EPA became the primary regulator of the coal seam gas industry in New South Wales, and it barely got a bump in its budget to do a really important job. But there have been, some gradual improvements. But the New South Wales Premier and Resources Minister, the Minister for Lane Cove, Anthony Roberts, they say we've got the world's best practice, a world-class regulatory and monitoring system, and the truth is that we don't. Our laws fall and regulations fall far behind other parts of the world, and the budgets to actually do that monitoring work are barely existent. So there have been gradual improvements, but there's a really long way to go.
My question is, you talked about people going up to the Pilliga to protest. We've now got the new regulations about people can go to jail for up to 7 years. I'm just wondering if the people there are concerned, or if they're deciding to go out and just do the same as they were doing before anyway.
Yes, of course, the New South Wales government passed anti-protest laws through Parliament just a couple of weeks ago. And, those protests were aimed squarely at the growing community opposition in the northwest of New South Wales trying to stop the Santos coal seam gas project. People called them the Santos Law, and they did so rightly. That was where Mike Baird was focusing. That was the rationale for those laws. Of course, they have a much broader impact, and it's a very serious impact that I think really fundamentally impinges on the right to assemble and the right to protest in New South Wales. They give police very sweeping powers to move on anyone, anywhere, from a public place. These are the sorts of laws, of course, that Joh Bjelke-Petersen introduced in the 1970s, that people, and the way in which people opposed those was to defy them again and again and again, thousands of times until those laws were proved unworkable. In some ways, I do believe that's the strategy of people in the Pilliga Forest. They know why they're there. They're there to protect the Greater Teeshan Basin, to protect the Pilliga Forest, which I didn't talk about, but which is the largest intact remnant eucalypt forest, on the eastern part of Australia. It's a really enormous forest, chock-a-block full of important endangered and threatened species, and sits on that recharge zone of the Great Artesian Basin. It's hard to know how those laws will be implemented. So of course it increased the maximum sentence for interfering, hindering with mining equipment on private land. The maximum sentence of up to 7 years jail, an enormous amount of time. In practice, of course, we know that the people often don't get the maximum sentence. If it's their first offence or their, second or third or fourth or fifth, they don't often get the maximum sentence. But it is quite a serious shift, and that one people are really worried about. And it massively increased the fines as well. It's something to be concerned about, but I think people are very determined to protect New South Wales from the industry.
Thank you very much, Holly. And I wanted to connect the CSG issue with the TPP. Very basically, it's because under the TPP, if the government does anything to even protect people's rights to health, and in the process violates agreements with corporations, foreign corporations in particular, they can be dragged to court. So, would you like to comment any more with regard to that connection and how the campaign against CSG is connected with the TPPA?
These are problems that are solved by regulation. We should have laws and policies in our state that mean that our best agricultural land is not ripped up for coal mines or coal seam gas. We should have laws that can be enforced or created where they don't exist, that protect people from living in a gas field and from the enormous health impacts that they might face. Of course, trade agreements like the TPP prevent governments or scare governments from regulating because they don't want to go up against potential lawsuits at an international level. It's not just the TPP, of course, like existing free trade agreements with countries like Korea prevent our government from intervening in massive licences like the KEPCO licence in the Bylong Valley or the POSCO licence in the Southern Highlands that are going to have enormous impacts on a pretty highly populated area in the Southern Highlands and Bylong, which is one of the most significant stands of strategic agricultural land in our state. And this is farmland that we could be farming and producing high quality food for 1,000 years. Mining companies want to rip up for some pretty short-term profits. So the bigger picture, of course, of the TPP and of other trade agreements, makes governments deeply cautious from doing what they should do, which is to regulate, to protect communities, environment and water from deeply harmful mining. So I guess a lot of communities are really there feeling the impacts and feeling the quite immediate threats to their drinking water. But the bigger picture here is, of course, the democracy, the ability of communities to force governments to create laws that are going to protect us and benefit us into the future. Protect farmland for the long term and drinking water.
But the other thing I just wanted to ask Holly to elaborate on was the maximum fine for protesting against a mining company that's breaking the law by mining without proper authority, $5,500, is actually more than the $5,000 penalty notice that the company might suffer in terms of breaking the law. So if that is democracy and justice, we're in for a rough ride.
If they're just doing a bunch of drilling and fracking without a licence, that maximum fine was a pretty paltry $1.1 million. But there's been a change in process to allow that just to be resolved with an on-the-spot fine of just $5,000. So if any of you, just feel like going out and doing some totally unlicensed coal seam gas drilling and fracking, you can probably afford the fine. But yes, the stark contrast there is the maximum penalty for, sort of basic, trespass on, land where there's fracking equipment, for example, in the Pilliga Forest, can be $5,500, so more. So, these laws, recently passed by the New South Wales government, are aiming to terrify people, to scare people from protesting in New South Wales and have some very broad-reaching police powers that can really impact a whole range of other social movements. In the legislation it says that industrial protests are covered by other laws, many, many laws, as those of us who take action in the workplace and their union know. But of course there are a whole range of actions that trade unions and unionists organise and other social movements that aren't just industrial action, other street protests that these laws, absolutely do impact on. So, big clampdown from the New South Wales government on protest, while basically a free ride to coal seam gas and other miners. That's the kind of state of play in New South Wales, and it's one that we've really desperately got to turn around.
It's about Camden,
Yes.
and the local GPs are helping the people who are affected by the coal seam gas field down there. How much they're helping, because I think that's what that community would need.
A bit of a health study underway with the Southwest Area Health, the doctors particularly working out of hospitals in that area. And there's a really wonderful organisation, network of doctors called Doctors for the Environment, some of whom, work in the Camden area and in southwestern Sydney, who are, there on the ground. So they've held lots of one-on-one meetings with families in their homes, small group meetings, and of course much bigger forums where they're listening to people, they're sharing back what they know from the research, and they've obviously begun recording and being part of advocacy and campaigns for these communities to get justice and to stop the gas field where they live. I think whilst AGL have brought forward that timeline for the closure of the Camden gas field, the only commercial gas field in New South Wales that's currently operating as to 2023, that's not a done deal, and I think AGL are absolutely vulnerable to pressure. The first thing that their new CEO did when he came in on the job last February was to order a total review of the company's coal seam gas business. And the essential result of that review was to sack all the senior staff and cut off that part of the business and to shut it down. And they've, over the last 12 months divested of all of their assets and put a deadline on the Camden gas field. AGL, they're a $15 billion company. They own, a lot of coal-fired power plants. They're actually the biggest climate polluter in Australia by far, by more than double of the second, which is Energy Australia. They desperately want to be seen as a progressive company of the future that's embracing batteries and renewables and energy efficiency. And they don't really want to be stuck with old coal and coal seam gas assets. And of course, unlike Santos, they have a retail brand, so millions of Australians at home in their businesses and their workplaces that are their customers, and who still have a whole lot of power to tarnish the brand of AGL and to convince them to back out of the gas field in Camden faster. And not only that, to hasten the closure of their coal-fired power plants and to build more renewable energy. Their CEO says they want to do that, and it's up to people in the community to make them do it a whole lot quicker.
Thank you, Holly.